you all for joining us this morning for the event Keeping It Real, Duterte's Drug War Slaughter and the ICC. I'm David Borden, the Executive Director of the group StopTheDrugWar.org. I also coordinate the Stand with Human Rights and Democracy campaign. My own comments today are not meant to reflect on the views of other speakers who will represent themselves, though they are consistent with those of my own organization. Keeping it real is an expression we use in the US sometimes. Maybe it's in other countries too, which refers to times when discourse on an issue or any matter may have diverged from what seems to be the obvious reality of it. While campaigning for president, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines promised a killing campaign directed at low-level drug offenders in which hundreds of thousands of them would be killed. NGOs estimate that so far there have been more than 30,000 extrajudicial killings. So there are other estimates that are more cautious. In response to the threat and more recently the reality of an investigation by the International Criminal Court, the Duterte administration has attempted to create an appearance of having an accountability process and of attempting to address the matter of the killings. The Philippine Department of Justice formed an interagency task force to investigate killings. It held a human rights summit, and in the media, in diplomatic venues where we participate as NGO observers, they have argued this case that the ICC lacks jurisdiction for that reason due to the Rome Treaty's principle of complementarity. Our view, and you will hear momentarily from one of the Philippines' top experts on this, is that the number of prosecutions and the very lengthy timescales over which they continue to proceed after more than 5 years of blood are too small to be credible. Now, this is Marco. Maybe you remember how many of these we have. We have held maybe 10 by now events at the UN and here at the in association with the Assembly of States Parties about the Philippines crisis. The first was in March 2017 at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna in person. The Vice President of the Philippines, Leni Robredo, provided a video for that event criticizing the president's drug policies, which became very controversial for a time in the Philippines. We were also joined in person by the now late chair of the Commission on Human Rights, Chito Gascon, whose loss to COVID-19 we deeply regret. But back to the presence. During the last week or so, the U.S. presidential administration of Joe Biden held a summit for democracy, and it had lots of important speakers. During the intro portion, Maria Ressa, the publisher of the Philippine news outlet Rappler and recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, spoke. And she also, during the last few days, spoke in Oslo, accepting the prize. Ms. Ressa noted the continuing detention of Senator Leila de Lima after close to 5 years during which she has only been acquitted of crimes she was accused of, not yet convicted of any. Her detention began not long after she had brought a confessed former member of the Duterte death squad from his time as mayor in Davao City to testify at the Senate. Ms. Ressa also noted that a broadcast outlet in the Philippines, in fact, the largest one, ABS-CBN, was shut down from its, not from publishing online, but from its broadcast operations. This happened in the middle of the pandemic, the country's largest broadcast network. So these situations are serious. Nevertheless, President Biden hosted President Duterte in Washington and accorded him a significant length, well, a few minutes, but for a large summit of this type, a significant length speech. We feel this is unfortunate, and it's not that we don't recognize that the U.S. has multiple interests, and it's not that we don't recognize that there's more than one way to attempt to address a problem, one of them being engagement. But we also note there are other autocratic-leaning leaders who were not invited to the summit, probably should not have been, but whose crimes fall well short of the scale of President Duterte's. This invitation for our Filipino-American allies has evoked ghosts of the past when US presidents supported the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And it's done so at a time when that dictator's son, Bongbong Marcos, seeks the nation, the Philippines' highest office, and does so in an alliance with the current president's daughter. I will now turn this over to my friend and colleague, board member of our organization as well, Marco Perduca. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, Dave, and good day to all. I know we are connected from the Philippines to the United States, so we are embracing 3 continents. Only a few things to try and remind us why we are talking about drug policy in the context of international criminal law. Since the beginning of our collaboration with Dave Borden and the CNET Foundation, also known as Stop the Drug War, we have put human rights respect at the center of the international debate on drug policies. Now, with time passing, unfortunately, not only we have concentrated our work on human rights violation, but also on violation of international criminal law and international humanitarian law. And this is what is at the center of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So if there has been or there have been several human rights violations around the world as a result of the application of drug policies, the fact that in some parts of the world, and the Philippines is certainly one of them, but there may be others, that there have been widespread and systematic calling into place the possible crimes against humanity have opened a completely new scenarios that not only were at the center of the work of several non-governmental organizations, but may also have been at the center of the work of existing international organizations like the ICC. While in Vienna, we have started to work on sharing information coming from the Philippines, collected by human rights activists, media outlets. Rappler has always been present at our events, but also by institutions based in the Philippines, like the Human Rights Commission. And what we gathered was, in fact, evidence, or at least hints at evidence of systematic and massive violations of international humanitarian law. And I think that thanks to those activities, and I see also representative from No Peace Without Justice, which was present at a couple of our events, the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC, in the end, decided to open a dossier and investigate those allegations. Now, I will not spoiler what is it has happened over the last 2 months, because I think Liz from Human Rights Watch will tell us about it. But we believe that the reputation of the ICC, or the reputation of international mechanisms that concern human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, are at stake here. We have been consistent from the non-governmental side in believing that those mechanisms would have been the most appropriate venue to discuss these things. We know what complementarity means, and certainly we have no problem in the hold of an investigation or in the prosecution whenever we see a national system that is functioning, but only willing and able, and functioning in the respect of the highest standard of national and international justice. But this, unfortunately, is not the case for the Philippines, especially in the moment in which national elections are approaching. And this is why we are insisting today, as a sort of a postponed side event of the Assembly of State Parties of the International Criminal Court, and we will continue next year when the next Commission on Narcotic Drugs will be meeting in Vienna. Two more things before I give the floor to our colleagues and friends for the keynote speech of Attorney Chil Diokno concerning human rights and what is happening in another venue where the UN is meeting, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. On the eve of their resumed session in an International Human Rights Day, the president of the International Narcotic Control Boards reminded member states that have ratified the 3 UN conventions that drug policy should be carried out in full respect of all known human rights, highlighting the fact that criminalizing personal use and possession of substances and schedules of the 3 UN conventions should not be treated as a criminal offense. On top of that, a document on arbitrary detention relating to drug policies that had been issued over the summer was supposed to be presented during the CND session, but unfortunately the Secretariat of the Commission blocked that presentation to happen. So even if there are offices and mechanisms of the United Nations system that are pursuing the common goal of certain human rights, there are other places more politicized where such a thing cannot be even heard. Of course, the statement has to be posted on the website, but one thing is to publicize something on the website, and one thing is allowing it to be formally presented. So we need to insist on the need to look at drug policies through the lens of human rights and through the lens of international humanitarian law, because unfortunately, in many parts of the world, these things continue to happen, despite the fact that the level of violence, if we take wars aside, all over the world is going down. It is a pleasure now to give the floor to Attorney Chil, I apologize, the real name, Jose Manuel Chil Diokno, who is the chair of the Free Legal Assistance Group, also known as FLAG, for his keynote speech at today's event. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Marco Perduca. Thank you, David Borden, both officers of the Stop the Drug War. May I also acknowledge the presence of Elizabeth Ebenson of the Human Rights Watch. Thank you as well to the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, the Asociación Luca Cosioni, the Filipino-American Human Rights Alliance, Forum Droge, Ecumenical Advocacy Network on the Philippines, and everyone who has made this event possible, and to everyone who's here as well. I have been asked to talk about the situation in the Philippines in relation to what is happening in the International Criminal Court and the investigation, quote unquote, that is being conducted, considering the recent developments that have involved some requests by the Philippines to suspend the ongoing investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor. Just to put this in the context that it should be put in, on November 10, 2021, the ambassador to the Netherlands of the Philippine government wrote the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court requesting that the prosecutor defer the investigation, citing allegedly thorough investigations being conducted by an interagency task force in the Philippines, led by the country's Department of Justice, which was looking into 52 killings that occurred between the period of 2016 to 2020. When the FLAG, the Free Legal Assistance Group, which I chair, and other human rights and civil society groups learned of the Philippines' request to suspend the investigation, we wrote the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And in particular, I am referring here to the letter that the Free Legal Assistance Group sent to Prosecutor Karim Khan. We pointed out the following. First, that the DOJ's purported quote-unquote thorough investigation into 52 killings covered only a fraction of the killings that were covered by the investigation authorized by the ICC. To be exact, in our estimate, only 0.2% of the 20,000 plus extrajudicial killings that have occurred in the Philippines war on drugs. And I will speak about that number in more detail later. We also pointed out that of the 52 cases of which the Philippines was supposedly conducting a thorough investigation, only 36 occurred between 1 July 2016 to 16 March 2019, the period covered by the ICC investigation as authorized by the pretrial chamber, and none of those cases that were being investigated by the task force covered the killings that occurred between 1 November 2011 and 30 June 2016 in Davao City, which is the other period covered by the ICC investigation as authorized by the pretrial chamber. We also pointed out that the so-called thorough investigation was not a real investigation, since it was merely a review of documents submitted by the Internal Affairs Service of the Philippine National Police, rather than an investigation as we know it that should have involved interviews of survivors, witnesses, as well as relatives of victims, examination of forensic documents and papers, and so forth. We also pointed out that the so-called thorough investigation did not meet the minimum standards of the Minnesota Protocol as updated in 2016 for investigating extralegal executions, and did not even consider or comment on the inconsequential administrative penalties imposed by the Philippine National Police. Based on the data supplied by the Interagency Task Force led by the Department of Justice, out of the 36 cases that are within the period being investigated by the prosecutor of the ICC, only 4 resulted in a dismissal. 24 cases, or most of them, resulted only in a suspension, and 1 in a reprimand, and 1 in a dismissal of the police officer involved. We finally pointed out that the alleged thorough investigation did not contain any findings or recommendations, but only quote-unquote observations, and totally ignored the clear directive of the Philippine Supreme Court that in all cases where the police claim that the killing was justified and admit to having killed a person in custody or in a police operation, criminal charges should be filed in court, and the burden shifts to the police officers involved to prove that the killing was justified. In any event, despite the protests coming from FLAG and other groups, the Office of the Prosecutor did suspend its investigation, but I must say that a few days later, the prosecutor announced that he would be requesting the Philippine government to provide quote-unquote tangible evidence of probative value and sufficient degree of specificity, showing that concrete and progressive investigative steps have been or are currently being undertaken to ascertain responsibility of persons within the scope of the authorized ICC probe. The prosecutor of the ICC also pointed out in his public announcement that any domestic proceedings in the Philippines must be conducted genuinely as required by the Rome Statute. In response to the announcement of the ICC prosecutor, the spokesperson of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, Cabinet Secretary Carlo Nograles, said in an interview with Rappler, 1, that the ICC has no jurisdiction to probe the government's war on drugs. Second, that a culture of impunity does not exist in the Philippines, since local institutions, and here he was referring to the Philippine National Police and the National Bureau of Investigation, have demonstrated, according to him, their commitment to accountability. So the question really that I'd like to discuss is, does a culture of impunity exist in the Philippines insofar as the war on drugs is concerned, such that no genuine investigations into the culpability, especially of those most responsible for the killings, can be conducted within the Philippine jurisdiction? Well, first of all, let's look at the data. There's a big question as to how many people have really been killed in the government's war on drugs since it began on July 1, 2016. While there is no definitive number of those killed up to the present, there is a definitive number cited directly by the Philippine Supreme Court in a case that was brought before them, in which I was one of the legal counsels. In a resolution of the Supreme Court dated April 3, 2018, the Supreme Court, citing an accomplishment report emanating directly from the Office of the Philippine President, said that 20,322 persons have been killed in the war on drugs since it began on July 1, 2016 until November 30, 2017. So at least from that period, which is roughly 16 to 17 months, we have a clear figure of people killed. Of those 20,322 persons killed, and this is, I'm still citing from the Supreme Court resolution, 3,967 were killed in police anti-drug operations, while 16,355 persons were killed by vigilantes, and those we call in the Philippines riding in tandem, motorcycle riding men, usually two of them in a motorcycle, who have conducted thousands upon thousands of extrajudicial executions in the country. So if we're talking about 52 cases, although really the number is not 52, it's really 36 cases, and you compare that to the total number of persons killed from July 1, 2016 to November 30, 2017, the cases being investigated by the Interagency Task Force led by the Department of Justice represent only 0.17% of all the extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs that took place from July 2016 to November 2017. How many convictions have resulted? As far as we know, there has only been one conviction of a case involving a person killed in the war on drugs. That is the case where the victim was Kian de los Santos, a teenager, where 3 police officers were convicted of murder. How many cases are pending in the courts? As far as we can tell, and this data comes from the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, there are only 14 cases pending in the courts, criminal cases arising from killings that happened in the war on drugs. How many cases are pending in the Office of the Ombudsman, which is preliminary to the filing of cases in court? According to the Commission on Human Rights, there are only 30, and there are only 27 cases pending in the Department of Justice. The Ombudsman and the Department of Justice are the prosecutors in the Philippine government. Before cases are filed in court, they must find that there is probable cause for a case to be, enough evidence for a case to be filed in court. How many administrative cases have been filed out of those 20,000 plus killings? According to the Commission on Human Rights, there are 73 that were filed in the Internal Affairs Service of the Philippine National Police and only 5 in the Office of the Ombudsman. So is there a genuine effort by the Philippine government to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible for the more than 20,000 killings in the Philippines on the war on drugs? I believe the data speaks for itself. Let me move on and talk about the more specifically the issue of, is the Philippine government unwilling or unable genuinely to investigate, prosecute, and punish perpetrators of these killings? Well, I must point out, and I'm not sure if many who are in this room are aware, that the reason why the Department of Justice and the Interagency Task Force only looked into 52 cases was because the president himself, Rodrigo Duterte, issued an order barring the release of other cases on grounds of national security. So you have the president himself who is providing obstacles to access to data by his own government officials in order to obtain what is information on what is really happening with respect to these killings. Earlier I mentioned the Supreme Court case involving the war on drugs. Let me just discuss this briefly. This was a case filed on behalf of one survivor and two victims, relatives of the victims of the war on drugs in the case I handled, and also on behalf of a community that had been heavily subjected to extrajudicial killings that was handled by another group, which both cases were consolidated into one proceeding. On April 3, 2018, the Supreme Court issued a resolution, as I mentioned earlier, that denied a motion for reconsideration by the government because the government had been ordered in previous months by the Supreme Court to produce extensive information on the war on drugs. During the oral arguments held before the Supreme Court in December of, if I remember right, 2017, if my memory is right, the court had ordered the government to submit to the court extensive data on how many people had been killed, how many had been investigated, what was the status of these cases, and so forth. However, the government did not want to do that. It sought reconsideration, but in April of 2018, if my dates are correct, the court denied the motion for reconsideration and directed the government to submit the data. In subsequent months, the government did submit, but despite the directive of the court that the petitioners and their counsels be given copies of that data, up to the present, we were provided with compact discs of the data, but when we tried to open them, they were all corrupted. And when we asked for clear copies or hard copies of the data, the motion was simply noted by the court, and up to the present time, we have not been provided with any of the data contained in those compact discs. So if we're talking about access by the victims or by civil society groups to what has really happened in the government's war on drugs, we don't have that access. One final point before I end and entertain questions. Is the criminal justice system in the Philippines capable of genuinely conducting an impartial investigation into these cases and into those primarily responsible for it? Well, there are certain factors I think that should be taken into consideration. Number one, just months into assuming office as president, Rodrigo Duterte started issuing what he called narco lists. In the very first narco list that he publicly released, he included the name of a judge who was already dead. It turned out that the name of a judge who was supposedly a drug coddler, that judge had already passed on months before the list was released, or sometime before the list was released. But consider the impact of that on the living judges who were sitting in the judiciary at that time and up to now. And they must have thought, if a dead judge's name could get on that list, how easy is it for any of us, our names, to get on that list? The other issue about the independence of the judiciary is the fact that the Chief Justice, no less than the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was removed by this government on the basis of an unprecedented quo warranto proceeding that was until that time unheard of in Philippine jurisprudence. Under our laws, the only way a Chief Justice could be removed was through an impeachment process in the Philippine Congress. However, that was not done. Instead, a quo warranto proceeding was filed by the Solicitor General, and the Chief Justice, Maria Lourdes Sereno, was removed. So that, again, had a tremendous impact on the independence of the judiciary in the country. And just one final point before I end. As of today, 12 of the 15 Supreme Court justices in the Philippines are appointees of President Rodrigo Duterte. By the time he leaves office in 2022, he would have appointed 13 of the 15 justices in the court. He also appointed the sitting ombudsman, former Supreme Court Justice Samuel Martires. He also just recently appointed the Prosecutor General of the Department of Justice, Mr. Malcontento. And by May of 2022, he will have the opportunity to appoint the entire commissioners and chair of the Commission on Human Rights. So if we are talking about an independent investigation by government officials in the Philippines who are key players in the Philippine justice system, I believe, again, the data would speak for itself. I will leave you with that and just leave the rest of my time to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Chel Diokno, Chair of the Free Legal Assistance Group, also known as FLAG. I guess that the number that you shared with us are an indication that yours are rhetorical questions, unfortunately. Let's move on now to Liz Evenson, who is the Associate Director of International Justice Program of Human Rights Watch, who has been following closely the, so to say, developments within the ICC concerning the Philippines, but in general, and the work of the International Criminal Court. To you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm just going to speak very briefly to the process we're seeing now following the deferral request made by the Philippines and what we can expect next out of this process. Some of this has already been said, so I think I can be quite brief. And I think nearly everyone on this call, just looking at the participants, is aware of the structure of the International Criminal Court and that it is set up as a court of last resort, meaning that it will only step in if there are no genuine proceedings by national authorities. This question of whether there are national proceedings is, of course, part of the prosecutor's determination in the first place as to whether to seek to open an investigation. And it was the prosecutor's determination in the case of the Philippines that there were no relevant genuine proceedings that would cut off the court's jurisdiction. And so she, at the time, the former prosecutor, decided to proceed to request permission to investigate from the court's judges. That investigation was then authorized in September and opened. But there are a number of provisions in the ICC's treaty, in the Rome Statute, that seek to ensure this balance between the ability of the court to act when there are no genuine proceedings and to defer to those genuine proceedings when they do exist. And one of these provisions is what's being taken advantage of right now by the government in the Philippines, and that is Article 18. Article 18 provides a very early opportunity for a state that is investigating to do so. And as I said, it's part of a whole series of procedures that seek to ensure the court is really a court of last resort, but also one that is resilient to efforts that are simply aimed at manipulating the process and leaving victims without access to justice. So how it works is under Article 18, once an investigation of the kind that was open in the Philippines is announced, the prosecutor notifies any state that might ordinarily exercise jurisdiction. And that state then has 1 month to request that the prosecutor at the ICC defer to national proceedings. So this is what has been done. And this is the letter that Attorney Chel Diokno referred to in November. The Philippines sought to inform the ICC prosecutor that it is investigating the crimes that would coincide with the scope of the investigation requested by the prosecutor. The letter, more or less, from the Philippines, from the ambassador in The Hague, more or less sets out the criminal proceeding, the general provisions for criminal proceedings in the Philippines, as well as the internal investigations, and refers to this review, which has just been discussed quite extensively. So the prosecutor then the ICC prosecutor then notified the judges of this request. But again, has already mentioned that, been mentioned. In so doing, the prosecutor stated quite publicly that he intends to request further information from the Philippines government, because it's the view of the office that this request to defer needs to be substantiated, that there needs to be sufficient information that would allow the Office of the Prosecutor to, on the one hand, determine the scope of this deferral request, because it's possible for the office to defer some aspects of the investigation and not the entire investigation. And on the other hand, that this claim of investigation needs to be substantiated. And that idea that it's not enough for a state to just say it's investigating or promise to investigate really comes out of ICC case law in dealing with the whole issue of complementarity and admissibility. The reason that the prosecutor has, at the moment, temporarily suspended the investigation, I don't think derives from any assessment yet by the office of the validity of the government's claims to be investigating. It's really more of an automatic suspension. The ICC treaty requires that when a state makes this kind of deferral request, that the Office of the Prosecutor shall defer to that request, unless the prosecutor decides to challenge the request and appeal to the judges for authorization to proceed. So I think what's happened at the moment is the investigation has been temporarily suspended while the Office of the Prosecutor considers the request. As part of that, they've requested additional information from the government to be able to make that assessment. And going forward, it'll be open to the prosecutor to take one of two decisions: to agree with this deferral request and suspend the investigation, not on a temporary basis. The treaty provides in that case that there can be a review, an ongoing review by the prosecutor to change his mind, for the office to change its mind that there aren't genuine proceedings, and then seek to resume the investigation with the permission of the judges. Or alternatively, the other option is for the prosecutor to determine that this deferral request is not sufficient, that there aren't investigations going on, that there isn't a prospect of genuine proceedings at the national level. And in that case, he will have to go to the judges to ask for their permission to continue. This is only the second time that Article 18 has been used at the ICC. The first time was in the situation of Afghanistan, and actually that process is still unfolding. So we have yet to see an entire Article 18 process take place before the court. In the situation of Afghanistan, the former prosecutor was received under the former prosecutor. No action was taken one way or the other to defer, not to defer during her term. And it was only in September that the current prosecutor indicated that he wants to move ahead, albeit with a limited investigation in the situation, and so has gone to the judges to get that authorization. But that request is still pending. And I would say that I think there's a fair amount of disappointment as to how long this Article 18 process is taking, and some unresolved questions before the judges in the Afghanistan situation as to what role victims will have in that process. So unfortunately, I would say we don't know a lot about what comes next, because of, on the one hand, waiting to see what the prosecutor will make of the deferral request. As far as we're aware, the government has not responded to the prosecutor's indication of requesting more information. And then the second level of uncertainty is really what will the procedure be if the prosecutor does decide to challenge the deferral? What will that process look like before the judges, and how long it will take? I'll just conclude by saying that today, my organization, Human Rights Watch, issued a press release making clear our view that the prosecutor should seek to continue the investigation as soon as possible, that the Article 18 request is really a very transparent delaying tactic on the part of the Duterte government when you consider the totality of the circumstances here. We have written to the Department of Justice for more information about the review that was announced. We haven't received a reply yet. So I'll just put in the chat the link to our press statement for anyone who wants more information. There's some links in that press release to the different documents and filings that are just discussed, as well as the statement by flag, which was referred to earlier. So I think I will leave it there. And again, thank you so much for inviting our participation on this really important topic.
Thank you, Liz Ebenson, Associate Director of International Justice Program, Human Rights Watch. If people present in the room would like to ask a question or make a comment, I would invite them to raise their digital hand in the reaction section of our Zoom window. While allowing some time for questions to come, I have two to start. One is, if the issue of this request has been discussed in the plenary at the Assembly of State Parties that just took place in The Hague. And the second would be, how can you possibly assess a genuine investigation if from what I understand, there's no possibility for ICC personnel to enter the Philippines now, after this request has been put forward? Who wants to try and give it a reply? Was this discussed at the ASP, or the issue of the Philippines, or not?
Perhaps I can take that one. I followed the Assembly of States Party session remotely. I wasn't there in the room. From what I observed, I don't believe that this came up. I know there's some other participants on this call who also watched carefully all of the proceedings. I would say that that's not unusual. Unfortunately, the Assembly of States Parties rarely discusses specific country situations. I think it's a gap in the system that needs to be remedied, where the Assembly of States Parties needs to take more carriage over cooperation in particular situations. But that said, I think with this being an issue that's pending before the prosecutor, may eventually end up before the judges. Also, I think it would be probably unwise to think of bringing kind of the political discussions of the Assembly of States Parties on this issue at this time. It's possible that a state may have referred to it in their general debate interventions, but again, not that I heard. And the plenary debates that took place were really limited to sort of general discussion of cooperation, general discussion of the court's performance review. In terms of how can an assessment be made of the genuineness of national proceedings without being able to access the country, I think this is actually a really important question. There's this very elaborate regime provided for in the Rome Statute, where there's many different off-ramps, if you will, for ICC investigations to defer to national proceedings. But what capacity does the ICC have to actually assess those proceedings, and how not to fall into a trap of deferring to a system that doesn't ultimately deliver justice? And we've seen some, I'd say, troubling jurisprudence at the court, particularly in the Libya situation, where there was a willingness to defer to national proceedings that were really marked by very significant human rights and fair trial violations. And I think the question is, what is the capacity among the judges to do this kind of assessment? That said, I wouldn't see not being able to access really a barrier. The government should provide information about those proceedings. There should be an opportunity to cross-check that information. I'm not sure that physical access is needed, but the sort of capacity to really deeply scrutinize what's happening at the national level, I think the resource challenges at the court come into play here in terms of what's possible. I should have mentioned in my remarks that even though the investigation has been temporarily suspended, the ICC treaty does provide an opportunity for the prosecutor to get permission if there are investigative opportunities, if there's a risk that evidence would be lost, to be able to carry out some investigative activities, even during this temporary suspension, or even if the suspension eventually is more permanent. So the hands of the Office of the Prosecutor are not entirely tied. That, of course, doesn't go to the issue of access, which is within the control of the government itself.
Thank you, Liz. Chael, would you like to add anything to this? Oh, you're muted.
Not much. I'm not really privy to what's happening in the Assembly of States parties, but I think it's a good opportunity to point out that this might have been the request of the Philippines does provide an opening for the court or the Office of the Prosecutor to ask the Philippine government if, since you're asking us for a positive relief, shouldn't you as well open up your doors to our investigators and allow us to see for ourselves whether there is a genuine investigation being conducted in your country. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have Eric Sterling posed a question. I don't know if you want to read it by yourself or I can do it. Hi, Eric. Anyway, the question is, what are the possible implications of different outcomes from the upcoming elections in the Philippines for the investigation by the ICC? This is actually even more complicated to answer than all the other questions, but who wants to try? Perhaps, Chael, you're there. So what is the situation vis-a-vis the upcoming elections? We have read candidates that put forward their name, then they withdrew it, and then they decided to run or not to run. They all have very heavy family names. What's going on, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, whoever does win the presidency in 2022 will have a very big say in whether the government will cooperate with the ICC or not. Definitely, this government has taken a stance of questioning the jurisdiction of the court and announcing very vehemently that it will not entertain any investigation within its territory. If allies of the present administration succeed in gaining the presidency, then we can assume that they will continue that kind of policy. On the other hand, if members of the administration, of the opposition succeed, then they will probably take a more open stance. However, again, this will also affect, I think, the question of complementarity, because if a new administration takes over that exhibits a genuine willingness to really prosecute and go after and punish those responsible within the Philippines, then I think the principle of complementarity would really move the ICC to allow the government of the Philippines to continue with those prosecutions. In the Philippines, so much power is vested in the president that just by any words, not even a directive, he or she could either hinder or promote a genuine investigation of criminal events in the country.
Thank you. Dave, anything to add? We have another 7 minutes.
Well, I in my own comments, I noted the Summit for Democracy here in the U.S. and President Duterte's speaking slot, which I think whatever benefits may be accrued to the U.S. from that, there certainly are some big costs. I think President Biden can mitigate those downsides by inviting responsible, democratically, human rights-minded leaders from the Philippines to meet with him in Washington. First and foremost, the sitting Vice President, Leni Robredo, who I should mention is running for president. He could invite family and associates of Senator de Lima and helped to raise up her case, which it got a great deal of international attention for a couple of years, and it still gets attention, but that has slackened, unfortunately. I think it really needs to be highlighted.
Thank you. There's another question coming from Eric Sterling. Are there other venues in the international community which could realistically be encouraged to express support for the ICC investigation or to criticize the resistance of the Philippine government to the investigation? My answer would be the Security Council, but it's a little too high in the hierarchy. Liz or Kel, what would you say?
Well, I would defer to Liz. I'm not too conversant with that topic.
Well, I'm not sure that I am that well positioned. I think usually we would look to different venues, the Security Council, but also the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights itself. I think for any ICC situation, there needs to be a web of political support built, because just the fact that the ICC acts doesn't mean that there is a existing political consensus in the international community about that action. So it's always important to try to build it out in many different venues. But in terms of what's realistic or what could be in motion, unfortunately, that would be a great question for my colleague working directly on the Philippines. But I don't know at this time what's realistic. I would hope again that the Assembly of States Parties itself at the ICC will eventually develop into a more robust partner on cooperation, where issues of non-cooperation could actually be addressed. We're not there yet on the Philippines in terms of sort of concrete non-cooperation, but I think we need to do everything we can to avoid getting to that situation, and more encouragement from states to remind countries like the Philippines that they still do have cooperation obligations, notwithstanding the fact that they're no longer a member of the ICC, but those cooperation obligations remain in place, and they should be reminded at every opportunity of that.
I have a question for Attorney Chell. As we noted in our event announcement, you're a member of the Senate slate for the One Sambayan coalition in the next May's elections. You've talked here about how much power rests with the presidency in the Philippines. Does the Senate have some options for for addressing ICC cooperation, particularly if the balance shifts towards opposition, or even if it doesn't totally shift, but some more people, perhaps including yourself, win seats?
Well, if the balance does shift, it may even be possible to rejoin the International Criminal Court, depending on who is elected president as well. Whether there is a shift or not, anyone who's elected in the Senate who carries a progressive stance would be able to have a strong voice insofar as the Filipino people are concerned. Whether the government itself would be receptive to any moves for accountability is a totally different question. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, some of the key players in the Philippine criminal justice system have terms that will surpass the president's term. The ombudsman, for example, who was appointed by President Duterte, will remain as ombudsman, if I'm not mistaken, for another 3 or 4 years beyond his term, the end of his term. The Prosecutor General, who was just appointed by the President, his term will also outlast the President's. So these are key positions that would determine whether any genuine accountability could be attained in the Philippines.
Thank you. Our time is almost up. But if I may add to what Liz has just said, I think the main institutional place where support should be coming is within the ICC. Considered as a court, the judges, not only the prosecutor to start with, the judges and the members of the Assembly of State Parties, the entire reputation of the ICC is at stake here. We are seeing in Libya, because Liz mentioned Libya before, not what she mentioned, but the fact that Muammar Gaddafi's son, against whom an international arrest warrant has been issued over almost 10 years ago, that is running for parliament, and no one has said anything about this at the governmental level. So the countries that were the leaders in establishing the ICC should get together, possibly as democracies, but not necessarily within a summit for democracies, and insist on the need to make, again, keep it real and make what this project that is old but new at the same time, that is the international jurisdiction of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, to become a reality and, so to speak, a threat against the perpetrators of the most heinous crimes, and make it function in the way in which it is supposed to function. So obligation to cooperate is certainly a key element to make this become a reality. There's one final, I think, comment coming from Joey Tranchina. Abraham Lincoln said, "In a democracy, public opinion is everything. With public opinion, I can do anything. Without it, nothing." Can anyone access the level of public support for Duterte's slaughter of drug users? At a UN meeting in Vienna, I was surprised at the level of loud support among some Filipinos for a public policy for vigilante murder. Okay, but this unfortunately has happened also in Filipino communities around the world. There's a big one in Italy, and 80% of them voted for Duterte the first time they were allowed to from abroad. If there are no other questions or comments, I will give the mic there. Particular nations that are especially committed to the success of the ICC, in which political organizations in support of the investigation would be helpful. This is another question from Eric Sterling. I'm not sure there is an answer to this question. When I was among those that founded the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, and in those days there was a group called the Like-Minded Group of Countries in support of the ICC. And in times, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were among the leaders of this, Italy as well, because it hosted the diplomatic conference that translated the idea into a statute, at least. And I'm not sure that this coalition at the governmental level still exists or is active, but perhaps Liz or other friends from the CICC or Notice Without Justice may know more. We may take another 5 minutes to try and address this request. Is there, Liz?
I can just answer that maybe very briefly to say that there are a number of different, I would say, like-minded groupings among states parties. It depends on the topic and it depends on the issue. And so I would say, yes, absolutely. There are many countries among the ICC's 123, the vast majority of which I would say are committed to the success of the ICC. But what needs to happen is to think about which countries would be particularly invested in the success of the Philippines investigation, and to build out support among those countries, coinciding with the general level of support for the ICC. So that's the kind of mapping that I think would need to be done. That like-minded group doesn't really exist that you were referring to, Marco. It doesn't really exist in name anymore, although many of those countries continue to take similar positions within the Assembly of States Parties. But I think the lesson that I've taken from advocacy with states parties is that it depends on the topic who the like-minded are, and you need to identify those and approach those quite specifically. I
want to add to something Marco said is Marco noted the extent to which the ICC's reputation could be affected by this case. This is all the more so, all the more the case because of the Philippines having withdrawn from the treaty, and even much more so because of the timing very shortly after the announcement of the preliminary examination. With enough like-minded countries committed to international justice, there would be real diplomatic consequences for governments that that make such a move and withdraw from international justice mechanisms, especially when it's the leaders of those same countries who are personally who may personally be facing charges.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. I would like to thank all those that participated in today's debate. I think it was very helpful. It's certainly, or unfortunately, not the end of the discussion around the Philippines or the human rights situation in the Philippines and the role that the ICC can certainly play. On behalf of the DRCnet, Associazione Luca Coscioni, Fara Forum Droghe, La Società della Ragione, and Ecumenical Advocacy Network for the Philippines, I would like to thank our host, Dave Borden, attorney Jose Manuel Chel Diokno from the Legal Assistance Group, and Elizabeth Evenson from Human Rights Watch. I guess in a couple of months, we may discuss this issue once again in Vienna during the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And happy holidays to all. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Attorney General, Liz.
Thank you.
Marco.
Thanks.